Well, Chris Bedford isn't just our man in DC. He's been the man in DC for over 2 decades. And Chris, you've seen just a ton of changes over the years in the city. So why do you think the Capitol needs all this federal intervention that we've been talking about here with Donald Trump and taking over the city?
Yeah, I have. I've seen the city. I got here in 2004, which was right after the bad old days. I mean, some of the American cities turned around their act in the 90s. Some others turned them around in 2000. Some of them were never able to turn them around. You had things like stop and frisk was introduced. You had the three strikes laws that were introduced in a lot of places in the 90s. You had mandatory minimum sentencing that was introduced to restrain these left-wing judges that had come out of this movement in the America in the 50s and 60s that had been towards rehabilitation and towards decriminalization and had resulted in a kind of nightmarish 80s and 90s for crime for a lot of people in a lot of American cities. It took a long time to get out of that. You had the crack epidemic, you had the breakdown of the families, and DC had generally itself been hollowed out in the late 60s by the last straw. There was a lot of riots throughout the Nixon years, for example, in the 60s and 70s. But the MLK riot really chased out the black middle class, the black upper class, and essentially all the white people just left. All that was left in DC was an underclass, a lot of broken families. And then drugs came in, and it was just a disaster. It took a lot of hard work to change that. It took a succession of mayors that took it very seriously, that worked really hard with development companies to try to get them in here and get them to develop places that weren't great, and to work with businesses and to start restaurants and to get things going where people no longer had to just eat at home or have those one steakhouse in the city of the Palm. And if you were the president, they always went there because that was the only restaurant outside of the clubs, really. It took a lot of work. It took serious policing. I mean, I remember when this stuff was fresh in 2004, 14th Street, for example, was a no-go zone. It was burnt out shops, flea markets, an AIDS clinic, and punk rock shows, which is why I would go down there. And there now it's a vibrant, or it was in 2020, a pretty vibrant place. I mean, the Obamas took their kids there to go out to dinner. Fast forward to 2021, and you see CNN reporters out there eating dinner. Well, gunshots erupt next door, and the people start fleeing because they stopped that policing that kept it all in check. They but they saw. I remember in 2004 there was a succession of brutal crimes in Georgetown. I was working down at a bar down there, Old Glory, which is since gone, and a jeweler was shot in the head in broad daylight by thugs who were robbing the place. An English exchange student was walking his girlfriend a night or two around there in Upper Georgetown when his girlfriend was sexually assaulted by a bunch of kids who weren't from the Georgetown area. And when he tried to resist, they slit his throat and he died. And the response from police was to put roadblocks and identity checks around the neighborhoods that the perpetrators and the suspects had come from, and to issue a summer-long citywide curfew for anyone under the age of 18 to be out after it's like 7 p.m. I remember it'd be at 7 p.m., we'd be at shows, maybe 6 p.m., whatever it was, and all the young kids would have to go home and get back to their parents' house or get back to wherever they were because they would be arrested. It was all taken seriously. And when things get good, you've heard the old maxim about hard times. When things get good, people forget about it. And there was always a kind of resentment that kind of was bubbling up in DC because there's no doubt that not all the communities benefited completely from the policing. I mean, there was benefits, there was peripheral benefits. There was no murders in the gentrified areas, and when there were serious crackdowns. The thugs used to refer to the different types of people in DC as taxpayers, which meant leave them alone, the cops will care, and everyone else, who the cops they knew wouldn't really care. Now, policing benefited all of these neighborhoods, but it certainly benefited the wealthier neighborhoods the most. And since DC is such a transient population of people who are professionals with college educations, who make good salaries, who come in and generally all work in one industry, largely. It's starting to change a little bit, especially up till 2020, with more business coming in, but they all work in the political industry. And then there's a kind of permanent underclass with decades of broken families, decades of no dads, decades of no jobs, living on welfare, and decades of crime that exists. There's a lot of animosity in the city, a lot of tension. And the activists noticed this and they took advantage of it. And they took kind of a well oiled but very corrupt Democratic machine took over the city council, the woke white liberals. I've met them. I've told them I'm not voting for them ever when they'd ask me for their votes. My vote. They came in and said, well, what if we broke this cycle? This is kind of a noble effort. Let's break the cycle where there's generations of young men who, from the age of 16 and 17, are in the criminal justice system and involved in crime, and we get them out of it. But their solution was not education. I mean, the one young, charismatic, handsome black politician before Barack Obama was Adrian Fenty, who came in and won in the landslide in DC. He was unelected 4 years later because he dared to ask why DC public schools were totally satisfied with graduating literally illiterate students year after year who had no prospects except for crime, even difficult to get into the military when you can't read very well or can't read at all. So you had crime or you had menial labor. And most of them chose crime because that was flashy. And that's what the pop culture said to do. And that's what they'd heard that dad had done if they'd ever met him. So he tried to challenge that. He got unelected, but the unions turned against him. So their only other solution was, well, we'll close the schools for COVID because we don't want anyone to get hurt. And we'll stop penalizing crime. And then maybe this generation will be freed from this. And there's an awful irony in it because now this generation, a lot of the youths in it know nothing but crime. I mean, some of the most awful and vicious attacks of the last 5 years in DC have been committed by these 13, 14, 15, and 16-year-olds who have no parental structure, who have no, who leave their neighborhood or stay in their neighborhood. They've got no moral role models. They've got no education. They've got guns that they're able to get on the black market. And they go out and they commit these heinous crimes, and then they're not held responsible. Well, now they're being held responsible. And the irony of this, just like the irony of the reformers in the 50s and 60s, is it ends up with an even bigger prison population. It's the exact opposite. And along the way, you have 1-year-olds getting shot in the head in the backseat of their father's cars. You've got 6-year-old girls getting gunned down by stray bullets. It's hard to even think about the human cost of these utopians and what they've actually done and what they unleashed on this city. And there's a sense of, even though in some places that you'll hear by these lemmings in the media, 30-year low, 30-year low, 30-year low. That's completely false. For example, they stopped counting carjackings as violent crime. And a carjacking is not a car theft. That's when someone takes you out of your car at gun or knife point or with tasers or whatever, forces you out of your vehicle and takes your vehicle. One woman got carjacked in 2021 at 1:30 p.m. with her 8-month-old infant in the back seat. That's insane. And that the perpetrator didn't care. An Uber Eats driver got carjacked. A 65-year-old father who was supporting 4 people and his wife got carjacked. And when he resisted, 13 and 15-year-old girl dragged him along until he hit a pole and was crushed to death. And when they were pulled out by police after this grisly broad daylight murder, the girl was more concerned about where's my cell phone. Give me a break. This is these individuals who didn't have any school, didn't have any consequences. The police's hands were tied. The prosecutors refused to do anything. The politicians were apologizing for them. The liberals were saying this is just an expression of voiceless people. Now they end up in the criminal justice system. And when they threw the books, supposedly, at these girls for murdering someone by crushing him to death in broad daylight with no remorse, that meant 7 years. Because the ridiculousness of some of the juvenile laws that we've created that these kids are put into, like, oh, they're just kids. I got news to you. If your kid is torturing a family pet to death, you've got a serious lifelong problem on your hands. If your kid is torturing humans to death, that ain't going to get fixed with 7 years of rehabilitation. This is a person who, through maybe a lot of them never had a chance. It's actually extremely sad, which is why the Adrian Fenty story is so sad. They never had a chance. They never had a family. They never had a moral compass, moral guides that teach the kind of things that teach your kids not to be animals. They never had policing. They didn't have schools. They didn't have teachers. And the teachers who do care get ground down and beaten down by the system. Or physically attacked in the hallways with no repercussions. I mean, what are they going to do? So these kids end up here, and then the solution was just to let them run free. And that's going to end up with a lot of people in prison. And usually this takes 10, 20 years of serious decline in the mayhem for you start to see a turnaround, for you to start to see a new generation come up and say, we're dispensing with this. But because of President Trump coming in, he said, no, it's over now. We're going to end this cycle right now. These 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds who are leading the next generation of 10 and 11 and 9-year-olds into this life, they're off the street. And we don't need to be stupid about this. We can roll up to Navy Yard and we see 20 kids wearing balaclavas in 91-degree heat. They're not COVID conscious. They're out to commit crimes. And I bet if we search them, we're going to find illegal handguns. And that's what's going on right now. And they're rounding up criminals, illegal handguns, illegal drugs. I mean, just a few years ago, you had the DC mayor of police on air in tears saying they won't let me prosecute illegal gun crimes. And more than half the time, within 6 months, I'm picking up that same person for murder or armed burglary or shooting. And then maybe I can get a prosecution. But that murder or that shooting or that burglary never would have even happened had I been able to prosecute that gun crime. And my hands are being tied by the politicians. Friends of mine tried to get in touch with him and say, we want to run you for office. But he was retiring. He was done with the whole thing. And I kind of get it. The good people get really ground down by this system. So it's really important for an outside force to come in and say, no more. It's important for police who don't always have to live there and be threatened in the communities to come in and say, we're doing something about this. We're going to take care of it. We're going to end that cycle. And even discounting the politics, just talking about the humanity and the human score of this, the businesses. I mean, I'll just tell one more story because I can go on forever with these stories. But a friend of mine's daycare that she brought her kids to shut down because the homeless would live out front and they would just sleep there and do drugs in public spaces. And what mother wants to drop their kids off at a nice licensed downtown daycare when they have to walk through heroin needles to get there? They're not going to do it. A nail salon a friend went to shut down for the exact same reasons. Who wants to go get their toes done before they go to the beach? If there are drug addicts and criminals hanging out on the corner, they'll go somewhere else. They'll go to Old Town. They'll go to Virginia. They'll leave. It just destroyed businesses. It destroyed a lot of entrepreneurial spirit. It destroyed communities. My whole Knights of Columbus council, all of the officers, except for one, moved their whole family out. And the year before, we've been begging the priest to reopen the Catholic school there. And he was rightly, sadly, skeptical, saying, I've seen people come through before trying to do this, and they all leave when things turn bad. But it was too dangerous for our families in our neighborhood, a nice neighborhood that used to be filled with children and parents when I got there, or people walking their dogs, is now just young renters and unemployed people because of this change in the city. It destroys communities, it destroys social fabric, it has human costs, and there are so many parents out there who are never getting their kids back because of these animals were allowed to run loose. And just screw the DC reporters, screw the politicians saying it's not happening. It is happening, and it's ruining lives. And thank God someone is doing something about it.
Yeah, that's such a good encapsulation of the 20 years that you spent in DC. And I can say this from living in other blue cities across the country. I had to live in San Francisco for a year. That's where work was headquartered. There are so many of the same stories all across the country, but it's good to see Donald Trump trying to go through and actually make something of our nation's capital, because this is important. This is what everybody, the rest of the world, is going to be looking at Washington, D.C. to see what kind of a city we are presenting for just all of ourselves out there, Chris.
Yeah, for a whole year. I mean, and in 2019, if you came into Union Station, there was a beautiful restaurant under the rotunda in the center where you could get a nice glass of wine or a sandwich or something. There was restaurants that were more affordable. There was a happy food court down below you could take your family to. There were shops. You could buy a business tie. You could buy electronics. You could pick up whatever you wanted to. It was like a miniature mall. And out front, you'd see Columbus Circle and the Capitol right there. It was so refreshing back in the day to leave vile, leaky Penn Station in New York City, get off the Amtrak in DC, and just be in this beautiful area with beautiful lanterns and quiet and wildlife, birds and squirrels and things like that. That's not like we had deer in the city, except during COVID. It was nice. And then after 2020, it was a homeless camp. I mean, complete with $500 and $600 REI tents that 21-year-old activist women, white women, had bought for these guys so they could set up camp at Union Station to do drugs, and the drug dealers you would see going from tent to tent, talking to half passed out people, taking the money that they'd spanged in exchange for another hit and not being punished. And all the shops shut down. All the restaurants left. There's a couple places that are hanging on. There was a shooting at one. And they would say, well, how are we supposed to do anything about homeless people? If they want to sleep on the floor of the train station, aren't they allowed to? This was the entryway to the United States Capitol. And there used to be a thing amongst DC politicians. They put a homeless shelter that was really a nasty place. It finally got shut down because of the massive influx of illegal aliens took it over. It finally got shut down, but they put it at one of the highways that enters Capitol Hill with the express point of telling DC's national politicians, you can't hide from the reality of the slums that the city has because you're unwilling to do something about it. I just don't think those local politicians thought that the guy who was going to do something about it was Donald Trump.